Christian C1 review covering Las Vegas and the world. If you haven't already, please make sure you hit that like button below and hit that subscribe button below to keep up with everything we have going on here at C1 Review in Las Vegas and beyond. We greatly appreciate it. Today on C1 Review, we are excited to have Sandy Davidson. Ms. Davidson is an attorney, journalist, author, and was formerly a professor at the University of Missouri School of Law. Her work has been published in a variety of scholarly journals. Today, she's turned her ample writing skills to fiction. She has written 2 books, and she's going to tell us about them today. Sandy, it's so great to have you on C1 Review. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I am doing well also. So before we get into talking about your 2 new books, why don't you tell me a little bit about your entire journey in law, journalism, research, academia? Feel free to share whatever you like for our audience.
Yes. Well, I always say I have kind of a checkered past. I started out as an oboe major, but my first semester in college decided, no, that's a hobby. That's not a profession. I got into philosophy. I got a PhD in philosophy from the University of Connecticut, came back to Missouri and got my law degree. I was teaching at law school when an opening came suddenly at the School of Journalism. Now, the University of Missouri School of Journalism is quite an operation. Anyway, I was delighted to get the invitation to come and teach communications law for a semester. I taught for 30 years and truly enjoyed it. I had marvelous experiences. I got to teach at our London program for a semester. I got to work in China one summer. Just marvelous experiences.
Oh, you know, no doubt have an unbelievable academia history, journalism history, law history, all that stuff. So you have written 2 new books. Now you're putting your passion into writing the fiction. The titles for the books are Sentenced for Silence and Deaf, Dark, Hollow Hole. Where did your passion for writing the fiction come from?
Well, first of all, Death at Dark Hollow Hole is actually a true book, a true crime book. My passion started actually when I was in high school. When I was a professor, of course, I had to publish, but I enjoyed that. So I was doing publications concerning, of course, First Amendment law, trying to protect journalists, executions. I have been interested in those. And I got to do a lot of academic work, but in the process, I was also attending trials, writing academic papers concerning them. But I got involved in Death at Dark Hollow Hole when one morning, and I was still, I was out of law school, but I really wasn't teaching full-time then. I heard a report on the local radio station that a person that I knew was basically, he had confessed, they said, to murdering his wife and daughter in the Jacks Fork River. The person was David Rothgibb. Now, it just so happened that he lived right around the block from me in Columbia, but I had been raised in southern Missouri with him and in his hometown. His mother was my piano teacher. Anyway, I heard that report and I thought, that cannot be correct. So I called the station and found out that no, he had not confessed, he had surrendered. Well, when you have a federal indictment come down against you, you have 2 choices. You can run or you can surrender. So that was the start of my interest in this trial. I went down to Cape Girardeau, spent a couple of weeks down there watching the federal trial. Federal murder cases are not that common. But I sat through every moment of trial, and I interviewed so many people, including the judge, who was quite a character. A lot of these people were as if they were out of central casting. The federal prosecutor, 5 feet 6 inches tall, 200 pounds. He was a tank. He just bristled with energy, and he had a very good win record. The judge, I thought it was interesting, was very familiar with the Jacks Fork River. And he had also lost a 12-year-old grandson. So here we are with a double drowning of the wife and daughter of David Rothgibb in a rugged Ozark river, the Jacks Fork River. I've floated that river, got the worst sunburn of my life on it, but it's beautiful, rugged territory. And one of the interesting things about this case, if the bodies had been found just 2 miles farther down the river, the bodies would have been outside of federal territory. The local authorities would have said accidental drownings, end of case, but the bodies were on federal property, and that's how we got Dean Hogue.
So let's look forward, and let me just ask you a general question before we first talk about Sentenced for Silence. Talk about what those inspirations were like for you when you wrote these 2 books. Obviously, one based on a true story and one a fiction story that's based on kind of true event.
Well, one thing I enjoy doing is trying to explain the law. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, if you like eating sawdust without butter, you'll be a success in the law. I think that's ridiculous. Law should be enjoyable. So in writing both of these books, I'm also trying to explain a lot of law. Now, with the Rothgibb book, we've got so many things going on with the investigations, with the polygraph test, the autopsy. I attended an autopsy, so I could try to write intelligently about that. You have the grand jury, then you have the trial jury and the sentencing. So all these things come together, and it's, I think, really enjoyable to get to explain the system within the context of an interesting story. So it's not just, dry reading. And same thing with Sentenced for Silence. The First Amendment is my passion. I want us to protect journalists. And I do think that journalists are under siege today. So Sentenced for Silence is a book about a journalist who promises confidentiality to a source. Then a judge orders him to reveal that source. And at that point, the journalist has a choice. He can talk and walk. He just has to tell the judge what the judge wants to know. But the journalist has made a solemn promise. So not talking means going to jail. And the rubric is you have the key to your own cell block. All you have to do is tell the judge what the judge wants to hear. Well, in my novel, I go into things such as, the case law on this. The Supreme Court has not been kind to journalists. The Supreme Court says, basically, and the context was in front of a grand jury, if you're ordered to reveal your source, you have the duty to do so. So you can be sent to jail. So I use a novel to explore that and to explore some other things that have been bothering journalists. For instance, knock and enter searches on newsrooms. Can you imagine? You're in your protected space with all your information, and knock, 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 and there are the police, and they're in. Well, we've got federal law that protects journalists from that. And so I used, again, the novel to explain that kind of protection for journalists.
In 2008, we had on Kate Beckinsale for her role in the movie Nothing But the Truth, where she went to jail for not revealing one of her sources. So in the beginning of the book, in Sentence for Silence, you write, the characters in this book are fictitious. The case law is not. Can you please explain?
Yes. I discussed quite a few cases in there. In fact, the beginning scene is a picnic scene, and they're eating peanut butter sandwiches. The journalist and his love interest, whose name is Rennie, she is a law student, and she's been studying criminal law. And there's a grisly Supreme Court case involving this poor prisoner who's sentenced to death. He's in the electric chair. There's a botch. He does not die. He said that he had this taste of peanut butter when the electricity surged through him. And then the Supreme Court said, it's all right to execute or attempt to execute the prisoner for a second time. He had survived the first time, and the Supreme Court said, the state can try again. So that's just one example. And I use the context of a public defender's office. Now, I worked briefly for the public defender's office, and it's amazing the kind of cases you get. So I drew on some of those experiences. If I can take a moment, just sitting as an observer in courtrooms can be so compelling. In Columbia, Missouri, we had a judge who was known for seldom being overturned. He was a judge's judge, if you want. Well, we had a murder case coming from St. Louis. It was the daughter of a powerful St. Louis judge who was on trial for hiring a man to kill her husband as he lay on their sofa. Well, I was in the courtroom. I was watching. There was this powerful judge who was accustomed to being in charge. His family was there. His daughter was down in the defendant's chair. I remember so clearly she was wearing a little pink sweater, and the state had brought in one of their really good prosecuting attorneys. And he made a devastating argument. And she started crying, the defendant, and he whipped around and he said, and where were the tears for your husband? And I'm sitting there, I'm watching this chilling closing argument, and the judge sitting there powerless. And the defense attorney, I'm sure one of the best defense attorneys you could buy, stood up and he said, I have 3 points to make. Well, I'm writing furiously. He makes 2 points and sits down. The jury came back guilty. That, to me, was one of the most compelling cases of equality under the law. That powerful judge was not powerful. It was the jury that gave the decision.
Very great story. I want to ask you one last thing before we talk about Death, Dark, Hollow Ho, one more about Sentence for Silence. Did the story of Judith Miller and what happened to her during the Bush years influence you in writing this book?
Yes, and in the back of the book, I do an appendix, more or less, and I mention her. There have been cases where journalists have spent a lot of time in jail rather than divulge their sources. So Judith Miller, there's been a whole host of journalists, and think about it. You promise somebody that if they give you information, you will not reveal their name. Now, if you do, that source may lose a job. That source may lose a life. So it's so important. Some of this information we would not get. We're talking about the flow of information to the citizenry. And without being able to occasionally promise confidentiality, I don't think it should be the general rule, but sometimes that's the only way to get information that's really important for the public to know.
Oh, there's no denying that. So focusing on Deaf, Dark, Hollow Hole, I want to say, obviously, this is your life story. You grew up with this life story, so you know a lot about this before you put this great book together. But I have to tell you, there's so many stories that we hear from the East Coast, we hear them from the West Coast, but we don't hear a lot of great stories from the Midwestern part of the country, which of course is Missouri. How important was that for you to shed light on a story that was in the Midwest, even though, again, this is something that you grew up with?
I love that part of the country. I love the people who are there. They're hardworking, they're loyal. I was caught up in part with the family dynamics. And of course, the dynamics can be anywhere, just as powerful in the Ozarks. The father of the woman who was drowned, and of course, the grandfather of the little daughter, Wendy, was convinced that his son-in-law, who he had loved, had killed them. And he told the prosecuting attorney that he wanted to take David Rothgibb to a shed and blow his legs off to get the answer. And the prosecuting attorney said, no, don't you do that. Let me prosecute him. The wife was exactly on the other side of the fence. She thought that David Rothgibb was being railroaded by a federal prosecutor, that it had been an accidental drowning, well, 2 accidental drownings. After the verdict came in, I think she turned around. By the way, the prosecuting attorney read my book for accuracy. So did one of the defense attorneys and the Fogels, the grandparents that I had just spoken of. And when she got through reading the book, Mrs. Fogel, Dottie, sent me this beautiful picture, a copy of this beautiful picture that April had made. And it's got hands moving all over the place. You have to see it to get the full picture. But she thought that April perhaps had a premonition. So it was interesting to me to be able to talk about quite a few of the people from southern Missouri, some that I knew fairly well. It was interesting. I saw one of my old boyfriends on the witness stand. The undertaker I had known for so long. David Rothgibb's best friend was someone I had known. It just a cast of characters caught up in this. And there's another thing. You have the Ozarks and, the wild, rugged landscape, but you also have the wonderful metropolis. You have St. Louis, and you have things that are going on there. So Missouri is the state. We've got the wilderness, we've got the big cities. I love the state.
Oh, no denying that. So here's my question. Why do you think people are interested in the stories of death and murder like this one?
Well, this also has running through it some romance. There was a girlfriend, and there's mystery. I think a compelling mystery where, you're trying to put all the pieces together. That's another part of this book. Not even the federal prosecutor could come up with a scenario that fit all the evidence. So one thing I do at the end of the book, I let different people who were involved in the case give their own differing theories on how the deaths occurred. And some people do not think that it was murder. Some still think that it was accidental drowning. So just the mystery in trying to tie everything together. There was an expert brought in. I think it's kind of interesting. He was the son of one of the presidents of the University of Missouri in Columbia. He was a diver. And one of the attorneys said when he was talking to him, it was like talking to Jacques Cousteau, just all the knowledge of the diving. And I was learning things that I didn't know. I've never been an underwater diver or anything like that. So there are so many pieces of this. The polygraph. There was a botched blood test. The crime lab botched the test because one of the rangers had left the blood samples out for a couple of days. And I think it's interesting that casts suspicion on 5 guys from Illinois who were camping fairly close to the Rothgibbs. So that was another piece of the puzzle, if you want. You have the 5 guys from Illinois brought in. And I think that was something that did concern the prosecutor. Was there somebody else involved? But in the last analysis, he focused on David Rothgibb.
But that is why I asked you in my last question, death or murder, because we do not know. And that is why I mentioned those two things. We really don't know. And I think that's what makes it more interesting. And of course, I think that story fits into the true crime genre of all these podcasts and streaming series that have been out over the last couple of years. And I think that obviously, Death, Dark, Hollow Hole is definitely meant for that. And I hope it goes there. And I hope that story goes there because people want to have their own theories to what happens to these things for people who are interested in the true crime drama. I'm sure you would agree.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
You're absolutely welcome. So here's my last question on this. What do you hope people take away from Death, Dark, Hollow Hole on that front?
I hope they take away the complexities of trying to do crime investigations, trying to do them cleanly, and all the intricacies that go into trying to provide a defendant a fair trial. There are so many people who are involved in having the criminal process work, the prosecution, but also the defense. And here's another part of the story that I thought was interesting. The defense attorney that Rothgibb hired was a young guy, and it was one of his first big cases, but he was able to put together a defense team, another very experienced attorney, and one of my law professors who ended up being a federal judge. So you have all these pieces that have to come together, and then you hope that justice is served.
So in closing, I would like you to tell us one more time what you'd like people to know about both of your books, Sentenced for Silence, which is obviously a fiction, and then Death, Dark, Hollow Hole, which is a nonfiction. Tell us about these and what you want people to know about them at this point.
Yes. Well, they are stories that involve the law, something that I love, and one is a factual piece altogether. The other, though, even though it's a novel, is based on our law. And I hope that it's an enjoyable way to learn about the criminal justice system and about First Amendment law and what journalists need to know what they need to protect them and what the public needs to know about how difficult being a journalist can be.
Oh, I think that that's absolutely fair. So Sandy Davidson, thank you so much, the great Sandy Davidson. Thank you so much for being on C1 Interview Today. We wish you so well with your two books, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It was an honor.